Well, welcome everyone. My name is Alexandre Bétourné. I'm Executive Director for the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform, or RDC-ADAP. RDC-ADAP is a program and a platform run out of the Critical Path Institute. We have a platform to aggregate rare disease data and facilitate data sharing and analytics to users throughout the world. But we also operate as a program, and we're working to leverage rare disease data to facilitate the development of new drugs for patients. Our efforts are done in collaboration with the National Organization for Rare Disorders, who work with us on communication, education, registry data standardization, and sharing. As part of our program professional webinar series, it's my pleasure today to have our collaborators from NORD present today's webinar. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Amanda.
Hello. I will get us started with a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please place those into the Q&A chat box. Make sure that it is set to send questions to all panelists so that we can ensure that we see those. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. All lines are muted to reduce background noise, and this presentation is being recorded and it will be available after the fact on C-Path's YouTube channel. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Rebecca Ani joined the National Organization for Rare Disorders in 2020, and she is the Director of Education Programs. In this role, she leads the Education Initiatives Department and works across departments to grow NORD's educational programs and resources for people living with rare diseases and their caregivers, healthcare professionals, and students. She plays a key role in the delivery of several of NORD's signature programs, including the NORD Summit and the Living Rare Forum. Eliza Fink joined NORD in 2021, and she is the Director of Research Programs. In this role, she oversees the strategic development, implementation, and growth of NORD's research and scientific activities, including the I Am Rare Registry Program and our work with RDC-ADAP. So with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to share about how we design educational programs and resources for patients and caregivers in our work at the National Organization for Rare Disorders. In my role as Director of Education Programs, though much of our work includes and involves other stakeholder groups such as industry, government partners, research partners, patient advocacy groups, etc. In my day-to-day work, I am hyper-focused on delivering resources to 3 target audiences. Next slide, please. And these target audiences are people living with rare diseases and their caregivers, healthcare professionals, all of whom are likely to encounter symptoms of rare disease during their career, and students. We have a network of student groups from high schools across the country who are raising awareness in their communities through medical schools and pharmacy programs and genetic counseling programs and other doctorate and master's programs across the country. So we are focused on empowering patients and caregivers, the healthcare professionals and researchers who work on their behalf, and the future healthcare professionals and researchers who will work on their behalf. So all of these target audiences that I am hyper-focused on day after day are adults and young adults. So to design effective educational activities for adults, it's useful to first take a look at education philosophy for adult learners. Adult learners are life-centered, task-centered, and problem-centered. Life-centered meaning they are seeking education with immediate relevance to their work or their personal life. They are task-centered in that they desire to learn a specific task, and once they have mastered that task, they are ready to move on to learn the next task. And they are problem-centered in that they are eager and motivated to solve a problem. and often collaboratively. We see that a lot in the rare community, patients and families coming together to work together and with other stakeholders to solve a problem that's present in their lives. And this is what motivates them to seek education to begin with, is to solve a problem. And now that we know these three characteristics of adult learners, it's important to also think about their why. Next slide, please. Adult learners are seeking one of the four wants, as we call them. Adult learners are seeking knowledge or competence to achieve one or more of the four wants: to gain something, to be something, to do something, or to save something, or in the case of the rare disease community, it's often to save someone. And therefore, next slide, please. We want to keep these three principles of instructional design top of mind when creating educational activities and resources for people living with rare disease, and especially for adult learners, to align with those characteristics of being life-centered, task-centered, and problem-centered, as well as their motivations of the four wants. So first, we want to identify the problem or dilemma that they're facing, where the gap in knowledge is, so that we can address it. We also want to keep top of mind relevance to their life with the question of what's in it for me for that learner. We want direct application for them to develop skills to empower themselves, advocate for themselves, and really accomplish real life tasks. And then always, as programming staff and especially educators, we want to think about assessment. How are we going to measure your adult learners' level of knowledge with the concepts you've introduced to them? So I've seen this done with polling. If you are using a webinar platform, there's often a polling feature where you can poll your audience to get some feedback from them at the beginning of the activity, or to ask them some quiz questions. And then you can repeat those questions at the end of the activity to see how their answers have changed and how their scores have improved. In designing an online course for adult learners, I would use a pre-test and post-test model of assessment, which is very similar, of asking quiz questions before they engage in your educational activity, and then randomizing and asking those questions again at the end to gauge what they've learned because of that activity. We also want to find out if we have hit our intended learning objectives, or in other words, the key takeaways that you want your learners to have from your activity or resource. And so I always want to ask a few survey questions of my learners after an activity as well. Next slide, please. So because I learn every day about types of learners in developing education programs, I spend a lot of time thinking about learning styles and preferences or types of learners, especially in adult education. And many of you have likely heard of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. Visual learners need to see it to believe it. They thrive with photos and pictures and charts and graphs and visual aids, and they really would love to see a video explanation of something. We use a lot of animation in our video work at NORD because animation provides imagery right away, so learners can visualize concepts as they're being explained to them for better and faster understanding, but also a better chance of recall of that information, or them remembering the concepts because they can remember what was displayed in front of them. Their brain didn't have to work so hard to imagine each concept, while also figuring out how those concepts are connected while actively listening. Additionally, animated videos are just a more entertaining mode of education delivery. Auditory learners learn by hearing and retain approximately 75% of the information they hear, at least for a short period of time. We all know that podcasts are very popular. Many people tune into radio shows to catch their news. Many people still enjoy classroom instruction and tune into lectures. And kinesthetic learners are our experiential learners. They need to do it to learn it. They are the first people to volunteer to be part of a role play. They love diving into a simulation. They may enjoy interacting with an interactive web page where a map of concepts is displayed. And then you can go into maybe one phase of that map, or if it's a timeline, you could go into one section of that timeline and then drill down deeper into specific concepts within it, but zoom back out to see the big picture. And they really are our hands-on learners. In looking at just these three types of learners, 65% of adult learners are visual learners. Thus, a lot of education work being done in video format in our portfolio of work. 30% of adult learners are auditory learners, and only 5% of adult learners are kinesthetic learners. However, our education philosophy today actually identifies 7 different learning styles. Next slide, please. Linguistic learners learn through speaking and language. They like to hear themselves talking out loud. It helps them to understand content. They are often voracious readers, and they really would thrive in a book club or a journal club where they do some pre-reading before they come to the discussion, and then they're prepared to discuss the material. Logical and mathematical learners are the folks who love the scientific method. They can help you put together a great flow chart. They know how to break learning into steps. They need proper sequence and flow. And they enjoy gamification because they can level up from pre-novice information all the way to expert level material. Intrapersonal learners are our solitary and quiet thinkers. They need a pause. They need time to reflect and to respond to questions thoughtfully. They're skilled at identifying connections between theory and practice, or theory and real life application. They thrive with reflective writing exercises. So if we were to put a prompt out to the rare disease community on social media, asking for folks to share their experiences or to answer a question, our intrapersonal learners are the ones who will respond. They also are the most likely to use an open comment box on an event, survey, or program evaluation. And interpersonal learners are the folks who thrive at conferences and meetings. They love to network. They pick up on every social cue and learn that way by interacting with others. They love conversations and discussion groups. They would thrive in small group discussions where then those small groups report out to a larger group and share with other groups what they discussed and what they learned. So while everyone probably has a top learning style or preference, we are a mix of different learning styles and preferences depending on the material, depending on the bandwidth, depending on our circumstances. So even if you are a visual learner who prefers to learn maybe from videos or visual aids, that doesn't mean that you don't also learn from podcasts or that you don't also learn in having discussions with others. So we at NORD have seen great engagement and success when we combine modes of education delivery to reach more than one learning style at once. For example, we may host a webinar that includes showing a video within it, and that reaches our visual and auditory and logical and mathematical learners. And then we can host interactive question and answers with experts for the interpersonal and linguistic learners. And at the NORD Breakthrough Summit, which is our annual flagship conference each October, we host a mix of different activities such as didactic presentations from the stage for auditory learners with visual aids for visual and logical or mathematical learners. We have many panel discussions with experts on the stage doing interactive Q&A with our interpersonal learners in the audience, as well as catering to our linguistic and auditory learners. We host lunch discussion groups for interpersonal and linguistic learners. And we also have a poster hall, which caters to our visual learners, our logical and mathematical learners, and our intrapersonal learners. But we also host poster hall networking sessions for our interpersonal and linguistic learners to connect with those authors. And even handouts that you can provide at a meeting will cater to intrapersonal and linguistic learners. Now, when it comes to a patient or caregiver who has been blindsided with a devastating, life-threatening, life-altering, or life-limiting diagnosis, the idea of participating in research, for example, can be entirely overwhelming, and the know-how to even ask about participating in research in rare disease does not come naturally unless those folks come from a science background. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, they're overwhelmed with questions, and we need to help them get some foundational education before they are going to be savvy about the scientific process, about topics like drug development for rare disease, etc. Questions are swirling around their heads when they are able to even think about research, meaning they're asking questions like, what does it even mean to participate in research? What kind of commitments would that take? How frequently would we have to go to a doctor or lab, and for how long? Would I be poked and prodded and feel like a lab rat? Would we need to go to somewhere other than where we go for care now? Would we have to travel? How would we pay for that? How would we get the time off work? Is there even research going on for my disease? How do I find out? Would I or my family even benefit from the research being conducted? What does enrolling in a clinical trial mean or entail? Would I benefit from the drug or product that's being studied? Would I be able to get that drug or product after the trial? If there is no clinical trial, how can I or my family still participate in research? And because adult learners are life-centered and seeking information with immediate relevance to their lives, and task-centered and focus on one task at a time before learning the next, we as educators need to build some scaffolding for them to learn. For example, how can a family that is overwhelmed with a rare diagnosis be interested in logging in for a seminar on data sharing when they are inundated with appointments, getting time off of work, caring for themselves or a loved one, battling insurance companies, managing daily tasks and durable medical equipment for their loved ones, etc.? How can they understand the potential of something like data sharing in the rare community if they don't exactly know what data is, how it's gathered, where it comes from, how it can be used, who's using it, and how that is part of the scientific process, let alone remembering what the scientific process is? Next slide, please. So scaffolding is an education strategy of breaking lessons into manageable units and then providing decreasing levels of supports as the learner grasps new concepts and masters new skills. So you can start with foundational education, utilizing lots of examples of how information can be used, using lots of visual aids and introducing new vocabulary with a lot of context clues, as well as lay-friendly definitions with graphic visuals and tools and activities that are interactive to allow for the learners to get their questions answered. And then you can guide the learner as they use that new information and apply it to their lives to learn additional vocabulary and more complex concepts, and learn how to use those concepts and how those concepts are connected to each other in the big picture as they apply the theories you're teaching them to real life. And then the learner can learn independently on their own and dive a little deeper into more advanced topics, or they can learn collaboratively with others who also already have that foundational education and the skills to put into practice for their lives. So one example of providing foundational education in our work at NORD to educate the rare disease community about rare disease research and the drug development process is a video that we created last year on data literacy. This video explores some foundational concepts about how research moves from an initial research question to improving people's lives. What data is exactly, how it's used and analyzed, how lessons can be learned along the way to improve research in the future. So we would like to share this example with you now.
Medical research is an important part of our lives. Vaccines against diseases, new treatments, new diagnostic tools, and so much more are all discovered through research. So how do we get from doing medical research to making an improvement in people's lives? First, we start with a question. To increase interest and participation in the research, the question should be something patients also want an answer to. For example, are women more likely than other groups to be diagnosed with a rare disease? Or, do people using a new medication have fewer headaches than those who aren't using the medication? To answer our question, we need to collect data. Data is a collection of measurements, observations, and recollections across people, or over time, or both. Data can be objective, such as temperature and medication used, or subjective, such as pain level and mood. Examples of data include measuring the number of white blood cells, how a person felt months after getting COVID-19, or seeing if a child can add numbers. To ensure we collect useful data, it's important that the tools we use are reliable and accurate. If we want to record the weight of an apple, the scales we use better be working properly. To test the scale's accuracy, we could use objects with known weights. To confirm the scale is reliable, we could weigh the apple multiple times to make sure it gives the same answer each time. Not all tools used in data collection are mechanical. Oftentimes, the researchers and participants themselves can be thought of as data collection tools, and we need to ensure they're reliable and accurate too. When asking questions, it's important to think about how they're worded, as well as the tone we use and our body language, especially when the topic is sensitive in nature. For example, smiling when someone recounts an upsetting experience can be unsettling and may cause them to stop sharing. Also, the questions should be reasonable. Asking someone today what medication they took 2 years ago will elicit less reliable responses than asking what medication they took this morning. Finally, the collection of data should be standardized, meaning it's collected and recorded by all researchers in the same way for all participants. Examples might include always measuring height without shoes on and recording the results in the same way. Once a sufficient amount of data has been collected, it can be transformed into information. Information is a summary of the data into a single number or set of numbers or some similar metric. It is not an assessment of the data, it is fact. Information can be expressed as a number, percentage, or average, and it's often visualized using graphs, pie charts, or bar charts. We might show the total number of headaches reported daily over a certain time period, the percentage of headaches reported by women versus men, or the average number of headaches for all people taking a new medication during a certain time period versus those who did not take the medication. Now that we have reliably collected accurate information, we can turn that into knowledge. Things we need to know about the information presented to us before we can start drawing conclusions and making decisions include how many participants were included in total. Were 50 people interviewed or 50,000? Who were the participants and how were they identified and selected? Did the researchers only ask their friends and family members, or was a nationwide survey sent to every mailing address on record? When looking at percentages, what was used as the denominator? Was it the total number of survey respondents, or was it limited to the number of respondents that met some other criteria? Is the information being presented in an impartial way? Is the information being presented as fact, or is the information being somehow judged as good or bad? We also need to determine whether the data collected is similar to what would be expected outside of the research environment, whether differences between groups are true differences or could have happened by chance, and whether there are any other factors that could explain the results. Once these questions have been answered, we can confidently respond to our initial question. Now that we have an answer, we can conduct experiments to determine which tools might be used to produce a more desirable outcome in future studies. If no known tools exist, teams can use the data, knowledge, and information from our research to work on their own questions. Taken together, over time, this is the scientific process and how new improvements are made.
So you've just seen an example of an animated introduction of concepts for visual and auditory and mathematical or logical learners. But we have also introduced foundational rare disease research education in a variety of other ways to reach learners with different preferences, exactly where they are. Next slide, please. To reach interpersonal, auditory, and linguistic learners, we incorporate research topics into NORD's Patient and Family Conference, the Living Rare, Living Stronger Patient and Family Forum. This is a free day-long patient education program, and our target audience for this program are newly diagnosed patients and their families, and people who are not yet connected to others in the rare disease community. So this program travels around the country each year to reach new audiences of rare disease patients who often are feeling isolated and have never met another person living with rare disease before. In 2023, we offered a breakout session on how to participate in rare disease research, and this covered patient registries and natural history studies, biobanking, and clinical trials topics. And then we also offered this general session on rare breakthroughs, hope now and on the horizon, which is about current research advances on behalf of the rare community and ongoing studies and government initiatives made possible because of community members participating in rare disease research to advance treatments and cures. This session closed out the day, leaving the audience on a hopeful note, knowing that there are researchers who get out of bed every single morning to work on their behalf. In another effort to lay some foundational education for learners new to rare disease who have had no reason to understand the drug development process before, and to whom that likely feels like a very abstract thing, we put together this visual aid to talk about the 5 stages of the drug development process in lay-friendly terminology. So not only with this visual aid are we trying to explain the 5 steps of the process with this infographic, we're trying to convey visually that as thousands of potential treatments shake through this funnel of sieves to each next step in the process, very few are tested in humans, let alone approved. And so in addition to explaining these 5 steps, we're also trying to convey why the drug development process is so long and so expensive, and why there are still so few treatments available in the rare disease community. Because until families can understand this, the big picture, how can they understand the even bigger picture of why rare disease research is so crucial, let alone how they can and why they are encouraged to participate in it? Next slide, please. We also provided this resource in Spanish, which is the second most spoken and understood language in the United States. Next slide, please. Here's another infographic that NORD created to talk about what qualifies as a rare disease in the United States, how many rare diseases there are, and how many Americans are affected by rare disease, as well as stressing the importance of the Orphan Drug Act and why NORD so fervently defends it. This is presented in an organized, quick facts at your fingertips way for visual learners, rather than putting an article in front of the community, in front of folks who do not absorb information as well by simply reading it. Next slide, please. We also provided this resource in Spanish for our Spanish learners. Next slide, please. This is a sneak peek at a resource NORD has created as part of an online self-paced course created primarily for patient advocates, funded by FDA through the RDCA DAP initiative. This visual aid is within a module of the course on advanced topics in drug development. And the module is all about the roles in drug development, showcasing different stakeholder groups involved in the process. So here we're trying to convey that there's not just a one-way road in drug development with all green lights and GPS to guide you, and that there are indeed stop-go points along the way and different points on the path where patients and patient organizations play a big role, and how they are part of important conversations and participation in the drug development process. Patients and patient organizations are central to drug development, as you'll see in the key on the right side of the page. And this visual aid was created to complement animated videos in the module that introduce the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders in the drug development process. Next slide, please. And here you'll see that we also produced this in Spanish, as we are producing the course in its entirety in 2 languages. Next slide, please. In addition to animated videos, NORD also incorporates a lot of storytelling components in our video education work, as well as in-person presentations and conversations at conferences and webinars. And this goes back to adult learners being life-centered and seeking education with immediate relevance to their lives. If you can hear someone with similar or shared lived experiences share about what happened in their real lives, how they made progress or overcame obstacles, what they learned along the way, what their advice is to others, there's a real power in that that can only be conveyed by those who have lived it. And suddenly, complex concepts such as the drug development process don't seem so abstract anymore when information is delivered by people who get it and who have lived it. Additionally, there are cultures where folks learn from their people and their ancestors through stories. Stories are passed down through generations to teach lessons, share history, and feel connected to each other. So in some cultures, storytelling establishes trust. So here are a few titles of storytelling educational videos on drug development topics that we've created with storytelling or a combination of storytelling with animation. Next slide, please. And back to that third principle of instructional design about assessment. Whether you've presented educational content visually, auditorily, logically and mathematically, interpersonally in person, etc., gathering feedback from your learners is so important. Your educational strategy can be constantly evolving when it's informed by feedback from your learners, by measuring their progress and their gains, and whether or not they took away the key takeaways you designed for them. Without gathering regular feedback from your learners to measure whether you've achieved those learning objectives that you set forth for them and addressed a gap in knowledge that they're seeking, because they are task-centered and seeking education relevant to their lives, you can easily get stuck in a set it and forget it mindset. And that is creating a new resource, plopping it on a website, or hosting a one-time webinar and letting it sit. And with that set it and forget it mindset, you can quickly get the results of outdated content and stagnant learning. So we encourage you to measure the learning of your learners. We encourage you to ask for their feedback and use those data points to continue improving your educational offerings. And you can tweak your educational activities as you go to empower the patients and caregivers that you serve. And now I will share the presentation space with my colleague, Eliza.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was phenomenal. I always appreciate sort of this opportunity to sort of self-reflect on how I can be a learner, and sort of starting to think about how we can really embrace the diversity of learners and really meet everyone where they are. I just wanted to spend a few minutes now kind of asking possibly this core question. Here is a project of our DCA DAP where we're usually talking about data. We're thinking about how to collect data. We're thinking about how to analyze data. We're talking about data sharing. And most of the webinars to date have really been in that space. But now, here we are, you know, and Rebecca just sort of shared this phenomenal information around education. And so just wanted to sort of think about why do we think that education is so core to data, drug development? Why did FDA sort of see this as a component of this project? And obviously I am not speaking on behalf of FDA here. This is sort of my sense, but I think there's a real strong and integral connection here that we want to be thinking about as we do our work. And so on the next slide, just wanted to sort of think about how we see the impact of this education in some real tangible ways. You know, and again, all of this, embedded in all of this, is really this empowerment and this really giving people sort of that seat at the table, that opportunity to sort of feel that they can be part of this process and understand if that's something that they want. And we recognize that that is a choice of, you know, that people have this opportunity. And so sort of thinking about some of the options and some of the activities, you know, the process to engage in research, thinking about consent forms can be a little overwhelming, but being able to start that process with at least a general understanding of why are we being asked for informed consent? Why is that important? What is, you know, what are the things that I as a participant in this research should be looking for in this consent form? How do I engage in this research? How do I advocate? How do I think about if this is a research project that's right, you know, for me and my family? And so having that foundational research, and then as Rebecca said, by being able to sort of scaffold that to additional and more advanced topics, gives people the sense and the space to really be able to think about, you know, their participation in research. And the hope is, as we increase this knowledge, it really increases the engagement of the entire community in research. Second, really being able to help and support and empower that engagement with regulators, with clinical research and industry. Because as we know, it takes a village. This work takes a village. We need to have everybody engaged in this work. And patients, caregivers, patient advocacy groups bring a key perspective to this process. And this educational work is really some of the foundation for them to be able to really support and help the engagement in this process. Lastly, many of you have leadership roles in patient advocacy groups, are engaged in patient advocacy groups, and more are thinking about the research that you as an organization want to engage in. And our goal here is really to help you in that process, to sort of show what can be done to provide that structure, to provide that tool, and with this knowledge to really empower you to really build your own research programs and really connect with other researchers to really build this sort of body of knowledge around your disease and rare disease more globally. And then, you know, and through all of this, through all these conversations, through all this understanding, to really enhance the data that we are all collecting, and really with the goal that it's usable, that it's impactful, that it has the ability to really advance the science and to advance our understanding. And we've really seen this firsthand as we think about sort of within the IM Rare natural history studies that we've done and our work with patient advocacy groups and providing the understanding, the education to groups has really sort of tangibly led to more engagement in their own development of these natural history studies and their ability to ask good questions, to think about things, and really to engage in the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it to questions. Thank you all. This has been fun.
Right. Thank you both. So as a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A chat box. To start with a short one that we have in the chat box right now, Rebecca, does NORD always translate all education materials into Spanish?
A big work in progress. We've made some major moves just in this year to do a lot more translation of materials and offering things in a bilingual fashion where possible. We've especially made strides with this in explainer videos on specific rare diseases that correspond with our rare disease reports in the rare disease database on NORD's website, and also in this new course on advanced drug development topics that we're working on within the RDCA DAP initiative, where we will be hosting a 13 module course in 2 languages. So we will have an English course and a Spanish course. But yeah, we're always working on trying to provide more in 2 languages, especially foundational education, because it serves so many patients and caregivers, and we need to start somewhere. So no, I wish. We're working on it, and there's a lot of work ahead of us to create a Spanish version of our website as well, where we have a lot of core educational materials and information provided in Spanish for native Spanish speakers.
So you've both mentioned these modules that are being worked on for RDCA DAP and more educational materials. Can you talk a little bit more about what is coming?
I'll pass that to Elise.
Sure. Thanks. So as mentioned, right, we really sort of are thinking about what is it, and some of, you know, what is it that we have heard in our conversations with people, that FDA has heard in some of their conversations. Where are the gaps in knowledge, and where are the spaces that we have an opportunity to really fill some of those gaps? And so we sort of collected all of that knowledge that we had heard and FDA has heard around where there seems to be either gaps in knowledge or sort of misunderstandings, and really pulled that together into a series of topics. And our goal will be to start releasing those modules, over time, with this sort of goal of hopefully the first ones to come out this fall.
Great. What are your suggestions for how we think about reaching other stakeholders with this kind of content, not just patients and families, but people who work with them, like getting this content into the hands of doctors, industry folks, nurses, etc.?
That's a big question. So I think I'll take a stab at it, Elisa, and then pass it to you for your thoughts. So ultimately, our target audiences are still going to be patients, caregivers, and patient organization leaders and advocates. And I think we can reach so many more through the healthcare professionals with whom we're building relationships. With NORD's Rare Disease Centers of Excellence network, we have centers of excellence across the United States with hundreds of rare disease experts at each in various disciplines. And I think that now we can really harness their power of distribution of some foundational education for the patients and families that they serve by disseminating, printable handout one-pagers in 2 languages, for example. We also have a growing list of healthcare professionals who receive a quarterly newsletter from NORD. We build those contacts often through our continuing medical education program. And our subscribers see thousands of patients across the country. So a big component of that quarterly newsletter is sharing not only what we have available in education for themselves as a professional, but what we are making available to their patients that we're asking them to share broadly with their patients. So those are some things that come to mind for me. Elisa?
I think you hit them all. Great.
Great.
So I'm going to combine 2 questions here for a sort of general question about how patient groups can use NORD resources, NORD's educational resources effectively, in terms of are they able to share them? Are they public access? Are they editable if a group wanted to sort of template it a little bit into their own, into their own community? Sort of how would you like to encourage patient groups to interact with and use the NORD educational resources?
I love this question. Of course, we want sharing of resources. Yes, I absolutely would encourage you reaching out to the NORD membership team about your interest in specific resources, and we can certainly talk about how you can share them or how you can distribute them to the populations you work with. Not all posted resources necessarily are public access, so it would be sort of on a case-by-case basis whether or not we can template them or provide them for use without acknowledging NORD, of course, and linking back hopefully to more of our resources. But we certainly are very open to the idea and encourage you to reach out to the NORD membership team.
Rebecca, are you able to speak a little bit to whether there's a profile of an sort of quote unquote average learner that you're trying to reach in terms of age, education, newly diagnosed, etc.?
That's also a big question. It depends on the program and it depends on the initiative, who our target audiences are. For instance, our patient and family conference, the Living Rare, Living Stronger Patient and Family Forum, our target audience truly are newly diagnosed families and families who have not yet found others living with rare conditions and who are often feeling isolated. They're likely still working to find the specialists they need and advocating for themselves. A lot of them are still sort of assembling, let alone quarterbacking their care teams. And so that is very foundational education. And typically it's a lot of parents of children or adult patients. But the gamut of when they were diagnosed really is huge. Many people have, conditions where they were diagnosed as an adult, but some have been living with a condition for their entire lives. And now they're feeling empowered to find their people and to, they've learned that they're rare. They're learning that there is this whole community out here for support. There are many sophisticated patient advocacy groups who have done a lot of foundational education and have established themselves for their rare disease, in which we want to be a partner, and we encourage membership with NORD so that we can support those patient advocacy groups. There are many patients and families without a patient advocacy group as a rare disease home. And so we try to serve patients and families with education through webinars, our video library, in-person conferences, and of course we focus a lot of our work on healthcare professional education. So those are folks with, training in the fields of some specialty that's going to interact a lot with rare disease patients, and we're trying to get them to acknowledge and identify symptoms of rare disease and screen those appropriately and accurately diagnose rare diseases. So we have a lot of learner types at NORD, starting with patients and caregivers who most often are adult learners coming to us, through those who are physician researchers. And we have a lot of patient advocacy groups who work closely with our membership team to gain education to support the patient populations that they work on behalf of.
Great, thank you. So being mindful, I think we're coming up on the hour, so I'm actually going to turn it over at this point to Alex to wrap things up for us.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you again, Elisa, Rebecca, for this wonderful webinar. This professional webinar series is going to continue, and we will have new ones coming later this year, most likely in October and November. But before that, I want to remind everyone that the Critical Path Institute annual Rare and Orphan Disease Conference will happen in September, on September 11th and 13th in DC. This is an in-person meeting and it's entirely free. We will convene foundations, industry, regulators with us at the table to discuss the Critical Path Institute efforts to accelerate drug development for rare disease overall, but also we will address broader topics that relates to rare disease and drug development, for example, digital health technologies, or diversity in clinical trials. So really a full-on conference for 2 days and a half, in person in DC. So please register and join us in September. Thanks everyone. Looking forward to our next webinar and to meet people during our conference.